For decades, the world knew her as the woman with the impossibly long hair and the voice that sounded like it belonged somewhere between country roads and open skies. But what if that image was never the full story? What if the most famous version of Crystal Gayle was not who she started as, but who she had to become in order to survive everything that came before the spotlight? Because before the awards, before the global tours, before the fame that made her a household name, there was a little girl in Kentucky who learned early that life does not gently introduce itself. It arrives loud, unfair, and permanent. She was born as Brenda Gayle Webb on January 9, 1951, in Paintsville, Kentucky, into a world where poverty was not an exception but the default setting of life. Her family lived in Butcher Hollow, a coal mining community where survival depended on long hours, tired hands, and the quiet acceptance that tomorrow would look almost identical to today. The air itself carried coal dust, settling into homes, clothes, and lungs as if it belonged there. Childhood in that environment was not defined by toys or comfort, but by adaptation. You learn to live with less, to expect less, and to keep going anyway. But even in that heavy atmosphere, something unusual existed inside the Webb household. Music. Not as entertainment, but as release. In a world where exhaustion was constant, singing became a form of breathing differently. The young Brenda noticed early that her voice changed the energy in a room. When she sang, conversations paused. Even adults listened. It was not ambition yet. It was recognition. Something inside her could shift the atmosphere around her, even if only for a moment. That fragile sense of stability shattered when her father, Melvin Theodore Webb, died in 1959 after suffering a stroke linked to years of working in the coal mines. His death was not just an emotional loss. It was a structural collapse. In a single moment, the family dynamic shifted from struggling to survive into struggling to hold itself together at all. Her mother, Clara, was left to raise 8 children alone, carrying responsibilities that offered no pause button. For Brenda, childhood became quieter after that moment, not because life became peaceful, but because grief has a way of lowering the volume of everything around it. Soon after, the family moved to Wabash, Indiana, hoping for work and stability in factory towns. But relocation did not erase hardship, it only changed its shape. The hills of Kentucky were replaced by flat industrial streets, and the familiar rhythm of rural life gave way to factory whistles and rigid schedules. Poverty traveled with them. It always does. For Brenda, this transition added another layer to her identity: displacement. She was no longer just a coal country girl. She was a girl learning how to exist in places that never fully felt like home. During these years, music quietly became something more than instinct. It became direction. And in the background of her life, another presence was growing larger than anything she could ignore. Her older sister, Loretta Lynn, was already rising in country music, building a career that would eventually define an entire era of the genre. To Brenda, Loretta was both family and phenomenon. Someone who came from the same beginnings but was now moving through a world that felt increasingly distant. That distance created something complicated. Admiration existed alongside comparison. Pride existed alongside pressure. And in the music industry, where identity is often shaped by association, Brenda was rarely introduced on her own terms. She was Loretta Lynn's little sister, a phrase that opened doors but also quietly closed others. It suggested promise, but also dependency. And for a young artist trying to understand her own voice, that kind of framing becomes a silent weight. When she began recording professionally in the 1960s, first under Decca Records, she was still navigating that weight. The early recordings leaned heavily into traditional country styling, shaped more by expectation than expression. The industry was not yet hearing her, it was placing her. And for a time, she moved within that structure, trying to understand where her real voice fit inside it. Everything began to shift when she later signed with United Artists Records and began working with producer Alan Reynolds. Unlike earlier experiences, this collaboration did not force her into a predefined mold. Instead, it asked a different question: what happens if the voice is not adjusted to the music, but the music is adjusted to the voice? That shift changed everything. The sound that emerged was softer, more spacious, and more emotionally precise. It did not try to compete. It simply existed. This new direction placed her in a transitional space between country tradition and pop accessibility. It was not fully one genre or the other, and that uncertainty became its strength. Early releases began gaining attention, but it was still unclear whether she would become a niche voice or something larger. The turning point had not arrived yet, but the foundation was forming quietly underneath. Then came the song that changed everything. Written by Richard Lee, "Don't It Make My Brown Eyes Blue" almost never belonged to her. It was close to being recorded by another artist entirely before producer Alan Reynolds made a decision that kept it in her hands. That decision would reshape her entire career. When she first recorded it in 1976, something unusual happened in the studio. The arrangement, led by pianist Hargus Robbins, was minimal but precise, creating space instead of filling it. And into that space, her voice did not push forward. It floated. When the song was released in 1977, it did not simply perform well. It crossed boundaries that were previously considered stable. Country audiences embraced it. Pop audiences embraced it. Radio stations that had never played country music began adding it to rotation. It reached number 2 on the Billboard Hot 100 and won a Grammy Award for Best Female Country Vocal Performance. But more importantly, it redefined how she was perceived. She was no longer an extension of someone else's legacy. She was her own center of gravity. Fame, however, does not arrive alone. It arrives with symbols. And for her, that symbol became her hair. What began as a teenage decision to let it grow without interference slowly evolved into something much larger than personal style. At first, it was control. A quiet decision in a life where many things were controlled by circumstance. But as her public image grew, the hair became an identity marker that the world recognized instantly. It reached extreme length over the years, becoming both iconic and physically demanding. Behind the image was a reality that audiences rarely considered. Maintaining it required hours of care, careful handling during travel, and constant attention during performances. It influenced how she moved, how she sat, how she performed everyday tasks. What the audience saw as effortless glamour was, in reality, a disciplined routine layered on top of an already demanding career. And yet, she kept it. Not because it was easy, but because by then, it had become part of how she defined continuity in a life that had changed too quickly in every other way. As her career expanded through the late 1970s and 1980s, she became a global figure in country pop crossover success. But even as fame stabilized externally, internally she remained grounded by the relationships that existed before success. One of the most important was her marriage to Bill Gatsamos, whom she met long before fame entered her life. Their relationship did not begin in the entertainment industry. It began in ordinary circumstances, which is precisely why it endured extraordinary pressure later. As her career grew, Gatsamos became her manager, handling the business structure around her success while she focused on performance. This separation of roles created stability in an industry where personal and professional lives often collapse into each other. Touring schedules, contracts, and negotiations were managed outside the stage, allowing her to remain focused on the work itself. Over time, this partnership became one of the quiet foundations of her longevity in music. The public often tried to simplify her relationship with her sister, Loretta Lynn, framing it as rivalry. But reality was more layered. There was admiration, shared history, emotional distance, and the unavoidable pressure of comparison. Loretta represented raw country storytelling rooted in tradition. Crystal represented crossover elegance shaped by evolution. Both were successful, but success expressed itself differently in each life. And over time, as careers matured and life shifted focus away from competition, what remained was not rivalry but shared experience. In later years, as Loretta's health declined, the emotional distance between the sisters softened. Presence replaced comparison. And after Loretta's passing in 2022, that chapter of public interpretation closed entirely, leaving behind something quieter and more human: family, memory, and time. Today, Crystal Gayle lives a life that is no longer defined by constant touring but by selective performance and personal choice. She continues to appear on stage, but only where the meaning remains strong. The Grand Ole Opry and special performances now define her public presence more than relentless schedules ever did. Her children have continued creative paths of their own, extending the musical legacy into production and songwriting, including collaborative work that connects generations of the family through music rather than pressure. What remains most striking is not just what she achieved, but what she sustained. A career that crossed genres without collapsing identity. A public image that became iconic without erasing the person behind it. And a life that, despite beginning in poverty and loss, never lost its internal sense of direction. Because when the spotlight fades, what remains is not fame. It is continuity. And in the case of Crystal Gayle, that continuity is the real story. Not the hair. Not the awards. Not even the song that changed everything. But the quiet decision to remain herself in a world that constantly asked her to become something else. And that may be the most difficult achievement of all.